From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the Wall Street Journal opinion page. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. Thanks again for joining us. Just a reminder to please subscribe if you're not already at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else. Do leave us a nice review. It helps with improving the flow of traffic and circulation, and it's always a nice thing to receive too. This week, I'm going to be interviewing Newt Gingrich, very familiar to all of you, Speaker of the House of Representatives, of course, back in the 1990s, author of The Contract with America, a radical new Republican Party conservative agenda that he very much pioneered and led in those famous 1994 midterm elections, of course, first midterm elections of Bill Clinton's presidency, led the Republicans to sweeping victory and in many ways changed, I think, the trajectory of the Republican Party over the next quarter century or so. Of course, we have a somewhat different Republican Party now from that very, shall we say, orthodox conservative approach. The Republican Party, of course, is led by Donald Trump, and we have a more populist MAGA approach to conservatism and indeed to the Republican Party. But Newt Gingrich is a big supporter of Donald Trump's, of course, big fan. In many ways, I think probably sees him as a continuation of the Republican Revolution that he set in train in the 1990s. And he is out with a new book, which I'm very interested to talk to him about. The book is called Trump's Triumph, America's Greatest Comeback. And he looks at the circumstances of the 2024 election, how Donald Trump became the first American to be reelected to the White House to a non-consecutive term against all the odds, against many, many challenges. But he also in the book placed Donald Trump in the broader context of the Republican Party, obviously, but of the conservative ideas in America and more broadly of the shifting political balance in America and indeed the shifting politics, the political demography of America, the evolution of America over the last decade or so. So we're going to get into that, ask him to what extent Donald Trump is really a conservative. Is he really a continuance of many of the ideas that Newt Gingrich himself had, and where the Republican Party and Donald Trump will go from here. So I'm delighted to be joined by former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Well, I'm delighted to do it.
We're going to talk first about your new book about Donald Trump's triumph in 2024. As you say in the book, it is a historically unquestionably remarkable achievement, not only to be obviously the first man to be re-elected to the presidency for non-consecutive terms, the first in 130 years, but to do it in circumstances obviously in which he left office in 2021, and of course the circumstances that he faced over the last 4 years with legal challenges and an extraordinarily hostile, if you like, media and establishment and everything else. How has he managed to do this? If I'd said to you 10 years ago, Donald Trump would be perhaps the dominant political figure in America of the first half of the 21st century, even you might have said, I'm not sure about that. How has he managed to achieve this historic level of significance?
Well, part of the reason that the subtitle of Trump's Triumph is America's Greatest Comeback is that it's really an intersection of a movement and a man. And you have to see both of them. The movement in some ways starts with Goldwater, then Reagan, then the Contract with America, then the Tea Party movement, and then finally Trump. And so there's this very large, somewhere between 40 and 50% of the country that's deeply committed to changing Washington and for whom Trump became their leader and their champion. And of course, after he was shot at Butler and stood back up with blood running down his face, saying, fight, 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 he became almost a mythic figure in terms of his emotional relationship to the movement that had rallied around him and helped create him. So I think you have to start with that. I think second, in a way, which is one of the great ironies of the modern period, historians are going to look back and say that the rigged election of 2020 was probably the greatest mistake liberalism could have made because it further deepened Trump's dislike of the establishment. And it gave him 4 years to reflect on what had worked and what had not worked and what needed to be changed. And the person who got elected in 24 was far more deeply committed to profound change in the system than the person who ran in 16. And I think it's now played its way out that way. And I was part of the America First Policy Institute, which for 3.5 years was developing ideas which began rolling on day one.
I want to move on to what this movement stands for and what are the kind of defining characteristics of its political ideology. But you just said there about the rigged rigged election in 2020. So just to be clear, by the rigged election in 2020, do you actually mean that you agree with the president's view that there was fraud that was carried out which denied him the election victory? Or are you saying it in a broader sense, as some people talk about, which was a heavily kind of manipulated election, manipulated by the media?
The establishment's, other than the fact that they tried to impeach him twice and tried to put him in jail 4 times, that the establishment's great gamble in 2020 was, for example, that you could have hundreds of millions of dollars spent by the founder of Facebook to selectively turn out precincts which happen to be Democrat. You could have all the major internet systems refuse to carry the New York Post coverage, which was totally accurate, of the Hunter Biden laptop. You could have 51 intelligence officers violate their loyalty to America by signing a letter that was totally false, suggesting that the laptop was a Russian hoax. I mean, take the total number of things done to rig the game against Trump in 2020, and it still didn't work all that well. And what it did, ironically, was it put Biden in a position he couldn't cope with and further convinced the country that left-wing bureaucratic big government was hopeless and had to be repudiated.
You talk obviously in the book about Biden and Kamala Harris, and of course then the Kamala Harris-Tim Walz campaign. Biden himself, of course, has been in the news a lot lately with more revelations about his cognitive decline. How do you view that whole period? It does look as though, and again, these are books coming out from media people who were not exactly hostile to Joe Biden when he was in office. It does look as though there was a pretty concerted effort by the White House and to cover up Biden's decline, and to a large extent by many in the media to collude in that. Do you think that's right?
Oh, sure. Look, I think that Jake Tapper deserves the Chutzpah Award for having first been one of the most militant defenders of the dishonesty about Biden's cognitive state, and then having turned around to make lots of money out of explaining how terrible it was that we didn't all know about how bad Biden was. I mean, it's truly one of the wonderful examples of the American system by which any scoundrel can show up and reinvent themselves. I think that for the long-term historical purpose, the real question is not Biden. We all know that Biden at some point, probably in 23, became incompetent. The real question is, for example, when there are 2,400 commutations signed in one day in January after the election, who approved those? How did it happen? Why that 2,400? Who gave the instructions to the person who controlled the auto pen? I mean, this is probably in its totality the largest scandal in American history, dwarfing either Grant's second term or the Teapot Dome, and certainly dwarfing Watergate. I mean, it's astonishing if you start piecing together all the different, the Secretary of Energy says they shoveled, that was his term, they shoveled $93 billion out of the Department of Energy after the election. Amazing.
There are efforts in the Congress, of course, to investigate this. Do you support that? Do you think, as you say...
Absolutely.
What do you think you might find? You might find people around the president who were somehow sort of, whether you did the auto pen phenomenon or whether it was people making decisions on his behalf that they had no authority to do so. What do you think an investigation?
Sure. Not just the White House, but the number of the cabinet officers. Look, there were people running amok. There were decisions being made totally outside the constitutional framework because, in fact, and I don't know what the date was in 23, but sometime in 23, we ceased to have a commander-in-chief. We have a person who was clearly incapable of functioning and who was propped up almost like Weekend at Bernie's. First of all, it's very sad from the standpoint of Joe Biden. He'd been a reasonably competent senator and a reasonably competent vice president, and yet his legacy will always be that he ended up being cognitively incapable and propped up by people who really owed the country a lot better service.
Just again, on the Democratic campaign last year, again, one of the things you talk about in the book is obviously that they were defending what were in many ways indefensible issues, the inflation crisis, the immigration crisis. But you also talk about the seizure by the kind of hard left, the progressive left of the Democratic Party of so many of this part of this ideology, this left-wing cultural ideology, whether it relates to gender or race. How much do you think that in particular contributed to the Democrats' defeat?
Well, I think it contributed significantly because, we run a project called the America's New Majority Project, and we do a lot of polling and a lot of focus groups. On issue after issue on the social left, the Democrats are in a 15, sometimes 20% position, almost never more than 20. If you say, should boys play in girls' sports, that's about a 15% issue. Should teachers be able to teach transgenderism without telling the parents? That's about a 15% issue. You get down a whole series of these things. Should we have merit, or should we have group definitions that get you promoted? Countries overwhelmingly in favor of merit. Should we pay people for doing nothing, or should we have a work requirement? Well above 80% favor a work requirement. Just on issue after issue, the AOC left is radically distant from the vast majority of Americans, but they've been propped up by money, by the labor unions, and by a good bit of the media. And so they seem much bigger than they are. And as a result, they may well, in fact, help define the Democratic Party in ways that last for several generations.
Okay, so let's talk about Trump and the MAGA movement and the MAGA phenomenon and the Trump phenomenon. As you said at the beginning here, then see this as the latest development, if you like, of a movement that's been going on for 60 plus years. You talk about Goldwater, Reagan, your own contract with America that you led, Tea Party. You say in the book, I think Trump didn't invent MAGA, he intuited MAGA. But as I look at that sort of timeline, if you like, or that progression of what we might call conservative, but other people might have other words for it, but that broadly conservative ideology, philosophy, if you like, there's quite a lot of evolution there. I mean, there's a lot that Donald Trump is doing that doesn't seem to square very well with what Barry Goldwater stood for, or what Ronald Reagan stood for, or even, dare I say, what you stood for back in the 1990s. What's the unifying connective tissue then in this movement? What makes it a sort of continuous historical process, if you describe it?
Well, let me start and say you've actually triggered a thought. I'm going to have to go back now and reread Conscience of a Conservative, which was the great contribution Goldwater made, much more important than his presidential campaign, because it educated a generation. And then I'm going to have to watch again on YouTube Reagan's A Time for Choosing, the speech he gave on behalf of Goldwater. I'm not sure that Trump wouldn't fit both of those, but I'm going to go look at him and try to put it in context. But what I would say about Trump, because I think this is what leads to confusion, Trump is not a conservative. He doesn't sit around and read Buckley or subscribe to National Review, which is part of why National Review doesn't like him. He's not even completely a Wall Street Journal conservative. Trump is the best and most powerful anti-liberal politician of my lifetime. And if you start from that premise, and he just thinks they're nuts, and he thinks that the country agrees with him, and he's quite prepared to take on all of these various institutions that he thinks are collectively, all of them out of touch with reality and all of them undermining America. And he knows that he has somewhere between 45 and 65% of the country with him day after day. In fact, as you know, just this week, Rasmussen reported that for the first time in the history of the poll, 50% of the country now thinks we're on right track. And the pollster, Rasmussen, said he was shocked. He never thought we'd get to 50% right track. And now with Trump, we have.
Is this the latest phase of this evolution of this movement, is essentially that it's a kind of a counter-revolution to the kind of liberal orthodoxies that have dominated, I mean, not just the left, but much of our institutions. It's obvious.
Yeah, look, I think that from Roosevelt in 1933 to the present, you have the continuing evolution of a movement which was for bigger government, more and more left-wing values, greater power in the bureaucracy. And it ultimately reached its peak somewhere between Obama and Biden. So that movement, I think it's fair to say, you can argue that Trump's counter-revolutionary in the sense that he represents the resurgence of the pre-Woodrow Wilson America, which was gradually submerged by progressivism and then by the New Deal. And the country, I think, had two different movements underway. One was people who genuinely believed in that approach, and the other was people who concluded that the alternative approach simply failed. So these two streams came together to create the MAGA movement.
But one of the obviously distinguishing characteristics, if you like, of Donald Trump, it seems to be a very, very strong belief in executive power. And I'm trying to understand, I mean, I think part of the revulsion at the liberal, if you like, the sort of progressive hegemony that's been exercised so much is this sense that, you know, particularly that executive power was being exercised in ways that were harmful to the American people, whether it be Barack Obama was doing it, but it's been even true of both presidents. And yet Trump seems to be even more of a believer in executive power. He doesn't really seem to believe, actually, that the other parts of the Constitution really count and shouldn't be allowed to constrain him. Is that consistent with what you've described as this evolution of this anti-liberal idea?
Well, look, as a matter of historic experience, if you're faced with a gigantic system, which has grown up, well over 60 years' time, and that system is prepared to fight ferociously to defend itself, whether it's in the media, in the bureaucracies, in the academic world, in the judicial world, if you're going to change that system, you had better have somebody pretty darn strong who can take it head on and beat it, because you're not going to beat it passively. And I would suggest to you that if you go back and look at Reagan did not defeat the Soviet empire by being soft or confused or passive. He had a focused power, but he used that focused power very aggressively and very intelligently. Well, Trump is taking on the whole system. I mean, we did some of that. I remember after we won in 94 for the first time in 40 years, I spent November and December, in addition to taking over the House and getting our folks trained, because literally nobody had ever served in a majority among Republicans except Bill Emerson, who'd been a page in 1954. So we had a tremendous amount of training to do. But I spent my spare time studying Wellington in the peninsula on the grounds that we were going to take on the entire national establishment, and we were going to do everything we could to change things. And sooner or later, we would get overwhelmed because the establishment was just too big for us to take on for a long time, although we're the only people to balance the budget for 4 years in the last 100 years. And we reformed welfare. We did a number of things. Well, Trump comes in, and I think in 16, if he had been accepted, he would have been much closer to Reagan than to what he has become. But I think when he was repudiated by the establishment, when the FBI lied about him, when the intelligence community tried to destroy him, when Mueller spent 2 years and achieved nothing, when the Democrats impeached him twice in the House, and then when he watched a rigged election, which he honestly believed he had won if it had been fair, I think that pushed him into a boldness and an aggressiveness to overwhelm what he saw as the forces of resistance, who, in almost a Lincoln sense, were repudiating government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so I think Trump, particularly because he was shot once and had a second assassination attempt that was stopped, I think he does feel that he has, much as Reagan and Pope John Paul II, who'd both been shot, had a conversation about why were their lives spared. And in their case, they concluded it was to defeat the Soviet empire. I think in Trump's sense, he really does believe God wants him to make America great again. And if that means you take on Harvard, or you take on the courts, or you take on the bureaucracy, or whatever, that's what he's going to do.
We're going to take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Newt Gingrich, former Republican Speaker of the House. He's out with a new book called Trump's Triumph, America's Greatest Comeback, which anatomizes Donald Trump's election victory last year and asks where it places Donald Trump in the context of the sweep of American politics. So stay with us. We'll have more.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
I'm back with Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House. We're talking about his new book, Trump's Triumph, America's Greatest Comeback, and indeed, the state of the Republican Party, the state of conservative politics in America today. Newt, when you were Speaker of the House, when you were in Congress, you led a very, very assertive legislative branch, a very, very assertive House of Representatives, indeed Congress more broadly, asserting its Article 1 powers under the Constitution. You did that, obviously, particularly with a Democratic president, with Bill Clinton. Nonetheless, there was no question that if anybody had any doubts about where the constitutional power lay, you certainly demonstrated it. Do you think we're seeing right now, and what we've seen in to some extent in Trump's first term, but even more now in the first 4 months of his second term, it does rather look as though Republicans, particularly in the House, we'll see, obviously the Senate maybe as ever, maybe slightly different. Republicans seem to be essentially kind of seeing their role as to toe the line to what the president does. First of all, do you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, look, I tell people Trump is the fifth great change president after Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, and FDR. And if you look at Jefferson and Jackson and FDR, not so much Lincoln, but Jefferson, Jackson, FDR, they had very similar relations with the legislative branch that Trump has. They were charismatic leaders. The system revolved around them. It was natural for the team to look to the president as quarterback. You occasionally had people who rebelled against you, and certainly you had an opposition party that was opposed to you, but they towered over the system and profoundly changed it. Imagine Jefferson going to Congress to get the money to buy the Louisiana Purchase, which was the exact opposite of everything he'd ever campaigned on, because he'd campaigned on frugality, etc. But, there's a chance to buy half a continent. They went along. Or look at the Judiciary Act of 1802, which abolishes 14 courts. They don't impeach anybody. The courts are gone. Therefore, their lifetime appointment left with the court. These things there was a strong Jeffersonian party. There was a very strong Jacksonian party. And of course, for the first 6 years of the New Deal, it was amazingly powerful.
So when you have a president, as you say, someone executing radical change like this, you don't think it's the job of the congressional branch, as laid out in the Constitution, to act as a kind of not even a constraint, but a kind of at least an alternative source of authority in the Constitution? You don't think it's its job to balance that at all? You think actually its job, if anything, to kind of double down?
No, of course it is. Look at how hard it's been to get the reconciliation bill through the House, how hard it's going to be to get it through the Senate, how hard it's going to be to get it through the conference and get it signed. And I hope that they can get it done before August 1st. But I'd hope for July 4th, and of course, Mike Johnson had hoped for Memorial Day. The constitutional process still works. Look at what the majority leader said about the offer from Qatar to give the United States a 747, and he said that's got to be investigated. We've got to look at it carefully. He didn't automatically salute. He said, the Senate and the House have to think about these things. I would not be at all surprised in the next week or two to see the House and Senate pass an anti-Putin bill of dramatically deeper than Trump's probably currently prepared to go. And I would not be at all surprised to see Trump sign it, because it's going to have probably veto-proof majorities.
I want to come back quickly to the Constitution, but since you've led us on to foreign policy, I want to get your views on that quickly. And you talked about Reagan, and again, this Trump as a sort of a continuation of this movement. But there are lots of ways in which Trump's approach to the world seems to differ from that of Ronald Reagan's. Do you think that you've just talked about the possibility of a joint resolution kind of demanding tougher action on Russia? Do you think Trump has been too soft on Russia?
I think Trump entered office thinking that he'd had a good relationship with Putin in his first term, and that somehow they could sit down and be reasonable and talk this out. And I think it has been extraordinarily disappointing to him and frustrating to him to gradually realize just how truly Putin is committed to rebuilding the Russian Empire. And how cheerful Putin is about lying consistently in their negotiations. And I think it's not what Trump hoped would happen.
And more broadly on foreign policy, there's also some concerns about the Middle East, about the possibility of a deal with Iran. Trump seems to be increasingly kind of concerned about Israel's prosecution of its war with Hamas. Do you think, again, there, and indeed has embraced very enthusiastically, of course, these Arab leaders, most notably on his trip a couple of weeks ago. Do you see anything there that concerns you in terms of the way Trump is approaching that region?
Well, I think a large part of it's been very smart. I think that what he's done with the Gulf states and the degree to which the Abraham Accords began to break out of, balance we'd had in the past, and the degree to which it repudiates the elite's 40-year-old belief that if you don't solve the Palestinian problem, nothing good can happen. In fact, Trump has been in the process of reintegrating the Arab countries into a larger system in a very difficult time. The Israelis have an extraordinarily difficult existential problem. They have a movement on their border that's probably 70% of the Gaza population that believes not a single Jew should remain. They have a huge power to their northeast, which chants routinely in its parliament, death to America, death to Israel, and which the Ayatollah has gone on national television about 3 months ago and said, I want to reassure you that death to America is not a slogan, it's a policy. That's a tough neighborhood. And it's very hard. And of course, much of the world, which is latently anti-Semitic anyway, is quite cheerful about deciding that it's Israel's fault because they're trying to figure out a way to destroy Hamas, which I think is an extraordinarily hard problem. Because it's not just about Hamas, it's about an entire population. And trying to figure out how do you re-educate them? How do you, for example, clean out the textbooks which teach children that if you have 10 Jews and 8 get killed, how many Jews are left? That's actually in the textbooks, which, by the way, we help pay for. Right. I think Trump has actually been pretty creative. He is building tighter and tighter networks. And it was very telling to me that when he arrived in the region, both in Saudi Arabia I think, and also in Qatar, that Air Force One is met by fighter planes to escort it. Well, in both cases, they're American fighter planes. They're in the Saudi and Qatari Air Forces. But it tells you something about how integrated we are in the region. And I think that that's likely to continue.
Back on the constitutional questions, you've said that Congress is essentially doing its job, supporting the president in some policies, but obviously standing up to him in some other ways. What about the judiciary? There is a view among a lot of Trump supporters that Trump is being thwarted by kind of activist, liberal, some even say Marxist members of the judiciary, stopping him. Most notably, we're recording this obviously on Thursday afternoon. Yesterday, we had the decision by the Court of International Trade to essentially rule many of his acts under the EPA action or tariffs to be unlawful. Again, we're on Thursday now. That's been appealed and there's a stay on that now. But that does look as though that was a pretty robust decision by 3 judges, one of whom was a Trump appointee, one of whom was a Reagan appointee. Taking that case, or more broadly, the kind of judicial restraint, if you can call it that, or resistance that we've seen.
To set that one to one side, because it's a technical fight, and they were arguing about the definition of one particular law. And that's exactly in their purview, and that'll be fought out. The idea that a district judge is superior to the President of the United States and can issue a nationwide injunction is insanity. I testified to the House Judiciary Committee, which subsequently passed a bill which would eliminate nationwide injunctions. And I opened my testimony with the 14 names of the judges who lost their jobs in the Judiciary Act of 1802. And I believe if the Chief Justice does not bring the district courts back in line and remand them back to being district courts who can issue district injunctions, if we continue down this road of random judges asserting their right to overrule the commander-in-chief and then impose on him, I think you will have a genuine fight, and it's a legitimate fight. I mean, the Federalist Papers are very clear. The Congress and the president can, in fact, overwhelm the judicial branch. It's clearly stated in the Constitution. It's clearly stated by the Founding Fathers in the Federalist Papers. And the precedent is clear in the Judiciary Act of 1802. And they are playing with fire. You have a nationwide movement, which is what I talked about as America's greatest comeback in my book, Trump's Triumph. You have a nationwide movement that wants real change, that wants America protected, and that wants to see that things can happen. And if we are forced to take head on a group of nutcake district judges who believe that they're each independently the equivalent of the president, it is going to be a mess. And in the end, they will lose.
You mentioned that, according to at least one poll, Americans see the country as being much closer to being on the right track than they have done for some time. And again, as I say, we're 4.5 months into this new administration. There's been a lot of things that have been done that I think it's fair to say, a lot of conservatives applaud some of the stuff that you've talked about, some of the stuff that Trump campaigned on, rolling back some of that sort of progressive ideological hegemony that we've seen in universities, in the media, dealing with the immigration crisis in ways. There are things I think a lot of people are concerned about, in particular the tariff policy, the economic policy. How do you wrap it all up and give Trump at this early stage in his second term, what sort of an overall assessment do you think of what he's doing? And what, if I may say, just in the context, in the same answer, what are the things that you might worry about that could be more of a challenge?
Well, I told the president and his team when they won that they'd won a ticket to the dance, but now they had to dance. And if they dance really well, they'll win another ticket in 26 and they'll win another ticket in 28. The key question for the 26 and 28 elections is going to be very simple. Is it working? If people think life is getting better, if they think America is getting stronger, you're going to see the House Republicans increase, the Senate Republicans increase, and you're probably going to see J.D. Vance become president in 28. If they conclude it didn't work, you're going to see Republicans get beaten badly next year. And so it's all up in the air.
Why might they conclude it didn't work? What would be the things that would make people say it didn't work?
Well, I mean, the biggest things are economic. I mean, if you think about just his trip to the Middle East, in a 4-day swing, he brings back $1 trillion in sales and $1 trillion in investment. He's doing stuff like this all the time. If the tax bill can get through, and I worry a great deal that they get it through this summer and not go on an August break until it's signed into law. If that happens, and we have the surge of energy that the tax bill is going to lead to, and the deregulation and all the different pieces that are in there. And if you have the tariff system gradually stabilize, which I think it probably will sometime around October, then you could have a Trump boom next summer, and you could be in amazingly good shape. I worry about Ukraine. I worry about Gaza a little bit, not as much because it's a terrible human situation, but it's not directly a threat to us. Ukraine's a problem in part because Putin has 6,000 nuclear weapons, and he clearly is on a messianic role of trying to reestablish the Russian Empire. I worry a little bit about Iran because I think there's a real danger of the Trump envoys being talked into a pretty foolish deal that's not enforceable. And then you just have to manage things. I mean, it is inevitable that there will be problems, that there will be difficulties, that you'll have to sort things out. But that's the business of governing. And as long as they do it reasonably well, if the economy is in great shape next summer, I think they're likely to have a very, very good 26.
And just quickly on the economy, you mentioned obviously the bill and you want to see it, the big, beautiful bill, whatever it ends up being, you want to see it passed over the summer. But it does look pretty clear that there are significant numbers of Republican members of the Senate who are unhappy with various different aspects of the bill that passed the House, but particularly, I think, people talk to people like Ron Johnson, with the scale of the deficit and what it adds to the debt. Do you agree with that? Do you think more needs to be done?
Look, I think they've already announced they're going to have a rescission package come up, which is spending cuts that can be passed by a simple majority in the House and Senate. I think that they need a second, much bigger rescission package. And I think that they can find a whole series of savings. I mean, this report by the Secretary of Energy that they had shoveled $93 billion out after the election in energy alone. You ought to be able to go through the whole federal government and probably find $400 or $500 billion to cut, which would make people like Johnson a little happier.
Wasn't that what Elon Musk was supposed to be doing?
Yeah, well, he didn't. But you can take the stuff he did do and still find a number of things that are worthy of being parsed. And the other two things I would say is sooner or later they're going to have to reform the Pentagon. I helped found the Military Reform Caucus in 81. I helped pass the Goldwater-Nichols bill in 86. And I tell every audience, if you reduce the Pentagon to a triangle and turn the other two parts into a museum, you'd have a much better defense system. It's absurdly overly bureaucratic. You could probably cut 200,000 employees out of the Pentagon on the civilian side and have a faster, leaner, and more effective Pentagon. And the MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again, if that starts to succeed, the difference if you don't have people get sick is so, remember, this is 18% of the economy. And if you could take 3 or 4% out because people aren't sick, you just balance the federal budget.
Newt Gingrich, wish we had more time, former Speaker of the House, author of a new book, Trump's Triumph. Thank you very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Free Expression. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'll be back next week with another look at a big topic in the news. In the meantime, thanks very much again for joining us, and we'll see you next week.